Presenting Benny Goodman and his music.
All right. Coming to you live from just about Penn Station. Evening, everybody.
Benny Goodman, ladies and gentlemen, the man with the torrid
I'm gonna pop
clarinet
this
and
up so
even
I'm
more
actually
torrid
even
band
on
who
my
pervades
own
rhythms
chat.
all danceable in the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago. And first of all, one of Irving Berlin's greatest hits, Blue Skies.
Hey, Jordana. Hey, Marie. Hey, Carrie, Luann, Timothy. Hey, Cindy. Cindy, that's a coyote. He's looking back, because we're looking back. Hey, Martin. Hey, Jerry. Looking back. Hey, Jerry. Hey, everybody. Hey, Dad. Bridget, Mary Jo. Hey, Jean. Hey, Megan. Yeah, I'm in a hotel. Been using the heat vent to dry my jacket. Hey, Elaine. Hey, Jerry. Carrie, I'll do my best. I missed this school group already. It was a good bunch of kids. Dad, not exactly. I got like an airplane bottle. I tried to order room service a while ago as I got like this credit on the card, but they do not answer the phone down at room service. I tried and tried, so I had to go out and get this rather mid-orange chicken. Most Manhattan food is remarkably mid. No, this isn't even as good as Trader Joe's orange chicken. Hey, Maureen. Hey, Dana. I did have a drink earlier when I went to get my Brussels sprouts. It was called, a drink called Where the Orgy At. It tasted like, you know, like a tiki drink. It's a few months early yet. Hey, everybody. Hey, Betsy. Hey, Dana. Oh, yes, I said the president, yeah. Wouldn't be the first time I'm blocked off from going to 30 Rock, or the whole Rockefeller Center complex, because he was there. Hey, Nancy. Hey, Betsy. Ah, thank you, Marie. Thank you for being here. I've only seen a little of this. It's kind of a rough video. A little longer than the normal ones, too. So we'll have a lot to do. Hey, Kathleen. It's very interesting reminiscing, because there's also a lot of talk about, within the video, about, we don't know how long this is going to last, etc. What I was supposed to do right now. Hey, Donna.
Benny Goodman presents Ellen Ward singing With All My Heart.
Hey, thank you, Laurie. Now, the rice is okay. I mean, it's rice. Hey, Jan. The biggest thing, I have so much Just bad counter food. Bad takeout all over New York. Thank you, Marie. Well, the first minis were about a week before this. So yeah, tonight we invite you to take a step back into that world when we were all figuring out what was going on and how to occupy ourselves for the next several months. And trying to keep a brave face on things. With all my heart. It was 4 years ago, but now we're into off to year number 5. Yeah, it was a difficult group this week because there were 3 groups, really. There was the drama group, the choir group, and the band group, and sometimes they were going different places. It required some complicated planning, and some of the trips that I threw in included military precision. But we did it. Oh, we did it. Saw the new Outsiders musical, breaking a personal rule of never seeing anything based on a young adult novel. I'm mostly glad I broke it. Just this once. We'll probably start a little bit earlier than normal. Usually we wait till Benny finishes another song, but this is a longer tour. All the wild wherefore, all of our careful. I thought I was going to get out of the entire week in New York here without buying a record. But no, with a very good deal on an original pressing of Hank Mobley's Caddy for Daddy to add to my Blue Note collection. Hello, Tanya. Happy anniversary to the Mysterians. We'll let Benny finish this song and we're going to get started. Yes, we're going back to a time when I didn't know what was going to happen, when I didn't know if I was going to be working again anytime soon. I didn't know if anybody was going to be watching these virtual tours, or if anybody anywhere would donate for these virtual tours. Or exactly how to do virtual tours. Hadn't figured out the practice of filming ahead of time yet, which is later what I would do. And much easier, so I can monitor the comments and things. And have this little bug down at the bottom with the donate information. Hey Mariana, hey Chris. We were kind of inventing a form as we went along here. And that itself is kind of exciting. I want to do a bunch of new ones this year. I don't want to keep doing reruns, even though donations are not what they were. Obviously, now that we have things to compete with. But I still want to keep on doing new ones. At the same time, I've still got like this huge backlog of stories that I've learned and then kind of forgotten because we have to move on to the next thing so quickly. Hey, Napur. Benny Goodman coming to you live at the Joseph Urban Room at the Congress Hotel in Chicago. Hey everybody! I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I am a tour guide here in New York and Chicago. Been working in Chicago a lot longer than I have in New York, though school groups lately I've just been doing in New York. So I got a school group in Chicago next week. Like, what do I do there again? Where are we taking them if they leave a 7-hour gap in the schedule? Okay, we'll figure something out. We always do. That's really what this is all about, figuring something out because we always do. Tonight is the 4th anniversary of our first full-length virtual tour, which, like so many other virtual industries, happened because all of my in-person stuff had been shut down. I'll explain all of that in here. I've just watched a little bit of it going back, and it's fascinating to see what stories I was telling then that I haven't really brought back much since. Just the whole difference in tone, the difference in style, the difference in setup, the difference in length. We'll see all of this, and I'll just stick around in the comments. I'll be up in the corner, but probably not saying too much. So everybody, welcome along, welcome back. Welcome back to the Age Jive, as Billy Joel would say. Here it is, our very first tour. It's going to be a little bit smaller, as it was filmed lengthwise. Hey. Hey everybody, I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out, including the upcoming Graceland Cemetery book from University of Illinois Press. I'm on the History Channel and the Travel Channel all the time, so I am incredibly famous. You should definitely pay attention to whatever I say. Now today I was initially scheduled to do a tour here at Graceland Cemetery called Health Scares in History. This was going to be the kickoff for my season. Tomorrow I was going to be jetting off to New York to work with a couple of school groups, but that was a month ago that we planned all of this, and of course, you know, the last month has been like several years, but the health scares in history thing seemed very timely. We've been through things like this before. So over the course of this, we're going to be wandering through Graceland Cemetery. This being live streamed, I can actually end it on the opposite end of the cemetery and not have to work my way all the way back around. If you've been on my tours before, you'll probably recognize some of these graves, some of these stories, some of these monuments. There are a few of them that really have to be on every tour at Graceland Cemetery. But there's also going to be some stuff that I've never covered before. This is a route with new information. It's been really fascinating digging through the old papers from previous pandemics and epidemics to try to find out some more about this stuff. All right, so I'm going to take the camera from Maiden here, and we're going to walk ahead. Good morning, everybody. I'll show you just a little bit of the entrance over here at Graceland. Graceland was founded in 1860 by a guy named Thomas Barber Bryan. And we'll talk a little bit more about him later on. He's probably the only person who knew both Abraham Lincoln and H.H. Holmes. So burials here began in 1860. They got going in earnest the next year. But as you can probably imagine, a lot of it was just people being brought over from the old city cemetery. And then, of course, by 62, you started having a lot of Civil War burials. How long is the tour? Leslie, I'm not really sure yet. Probably in the hour or so range. About the same length as my regular tour, 75 to 90 minutes. So, after the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, Thomas Bryan went to a meeting and offered the city burial spaces for soldiers here at Graceland Cemetery. But they figured, you know, Rose Hill already has a section for soldiers. The war's not going to be big enough that we need 2 of them. So they turned Bryan down. There had, however, been a soldier reposing in the vault for some months, so I think this is the section he planned to be for soldiers. And in the end, when they turned him down, like the day after they turned him down, he donated the space to a soldier named William Webb. William Webb had died a few months previous, back in 1861. He was one of the first people to sign up for the Army during the Civil War. Now, during the Civil War, the first thing he did was his unit was marched out to Springfield, Missouri. They had to march like 75 miles in a couple of days through the cold November rain without shelter. As soon as they got to Springfield, Springfield was evacuated. They had to march all the way back, once again through the cold November rain. So this probably left him weak to begin with and especially susceptible to typhoid fever, which is what he died of. Now, typhoid fever is a disease that spreads a lot in cramped conditions through things like contaminated water. And in fact, that first year of the Civil War, something like 1% of the Army died due to typhoid fever. And now Webb has kind of this hidden grave. Early reviews of the cemetery, early newspaper articles about it, talked a lot about the very prominent grave of William Webb. But an awful lot of the gravestones from back then, you really can't read anymore. This one, you just have to kind of know that it's the grave of Captain William Webb. All right, we'll move on a little bit more from here.
So typhoid fever was a major killer at the time. It's very common for me to see people dying in the internment books of that. There's going to be a little more death on this tour than most of my others. Believe it or not, most of my cemetery tours aren't really about death, I don't think. They're about dead people. But I'd rather talk about stories from their lives, usually a lot more than their causes of death. The Graceland book is going to have quotes from everybody at the beginning of every entry, and as often as possible, I didn't want to use a stirring war speech or a political speech or anything like that. I wanted to find an example of them telling a joke, something that would show what they were like as a person. So going into the entrance here. All right. Actually, it's not that hard to hold a candle in the whole November rain, Shamet. I've tried it. All right, we have a boulder here for Malcolm. Now, back around on the other side is Robert Malcolm, grandfather. Now, his actual date of death... Okay, I'll have you take that for a second. Now, Robert Malcolm's actual date of death was October 8th, 1871. Anybody even vaguely familiar with Chicago history knows that date. That is the day of the Great Chicago Fire. But when Robert Malcolm died on October 8th of 1871, he died of dropsy, which is a congestive heart disease that causes a lot of water swelling. It causes your whole body to swell up. It was a fairly common cause of death at the time. And it's very interesting to go looking through the record books and the internment books here of the people who died on October 8th of 1871. I keep a few of them here. Among the causes of death, there's only one guy I know of in Graceland Cemetery here who died of the Great Chicago Fire. We also have accidental, convulsions, typhoid fever, consumption, which is what they called tuberculosis back then, dropsy, that'll be Robert, cholera infantum, convulsions, cancer, scarlet fever. People kept on dying of the same old things. The world doesn't stop. You don't get a reprieve from your health just because the entire city's on fire. And I think that's kind of instructive now. That's why we're working to flatten the curve now, because there are still, if we fill up the hospitals completely, what happens to all the people who have other diseases already? We need spaces for more than just the people with COVID-19. We'll move on from here a little bit. It's been very interesting doing the research on this because you find a lot of the same stuff just over and over again. The world hasn't changed that much. Over here, this is Eli Williams, early businessman. I tried to find a good anecdote about him. About the most interesting one I could find was when he first came to Chicago, he and his wife went to the Sauganash Hotel, but it was full of Potawatomi Native Americans who were sitting in the lobby without their shirts on. His wife freaked out and insisted that they leave. I decided not to put that in the book. Sometimes the best way to cut people historical slack is just to leave stuff out. All right, so right over here in the Bigman plot there was a guy named Stillman B. Jamieson, who I guess was his son-in-law. He was a prominent lawyer in Chicago. But down below, Stillman B. Jamieson Jr., the date of death of October 14th, 1918. Now, this is as far as I know, this is the earliest person within the cemetery who died of what they would have then called the Spanish flu, the 1918 pandemic. Now, he was stationed with the Army at the time. Now, I've had them go through the records here. They only found one person in the record book who specifically has Spanish influenza listed as the cause of death. But there were dozens of people who were just listed as influenza, and quite a lot more who were listed as dying of pneumonia. Stillman B. Jamieson officially died of pneumonia, which was a common complication from that 1918 pandemic. Now, at the time, they didn't really understand even that it was a virus. Those kind of things were still things that they were debating. You would see people saying that they were bacteria. You would see a lot of different stuff about how many people had it at any given time, how dangerous it was. Even now, there was a guy on TV just the other day saying the Spanish influenza had a 50% death rate. It certainly wasn't that high, but you can read anything from 0.5% out of 1 out of 200 people who got it all the way up to 20%. Now, just illustrative, I found this one day of the Chicago Tribune from the time of the Spanish flu. We've got this flu cures and causes analyzed. This guy thought it was bacteria, specifically said that only 1 in 200 people will die, so it's nothing to get in a funk over. We've also got how to make your own mask. Influenza cases here estimated at 40,000 to 60,000. That's really quite a spread. You can sometimes see that as many as a third of all people ended up getting it. And there's this there's this cartoon where the mother says, "Don't you think you'll be able to go to school tomorrow, Martin?" And also a little bit about spiritualism. That's more to do with World War I. You could actually read that there's pretty good arguments that it was really the Spanish influenza, the 1918 pandemic, that pushed people towards having the armistice in the first place, more than any military operations. We'll keep moving on from here a little bit. This is the Carter plot, which I could really only tell the story of that one on 18 and over tours. Now, coming up right on the right here is John B. Dickey, who was killed in what would have been the Great Chicago Fire at the time, the one in 1857. Now, at the time, we did not have a proper fire department. We just had a lot of independent ones that induced people to come help fight fires with offers of free whiskey. We had only just established a hospital a few years before. Now, Chicago became a city in 1837, 1834, we became a town. When we became a town, this guy here, Orsemus Morrison, was our first coroner. He had a job that was elected as a high constable, which also made you like several other offices. It was like when you, in a sitcom where you pull into a small town and the same guy is the sheriff, the mayor, the health inspector, and every other job. And nearby him over here, this is just a little, this is just a little thing that I like to point out. This is W.R. Loomis. He was a real estate man and a horse owner. He owned a wholesome trotting horse by the name of Legal Tender. Now, he was also a spokesman for quack medicine. It was this is an advertisement that he took out. 50 years a sufferer of 50 years a sufferer of rheumatism until he tried Dr. Horn's electromagnetic belt. In the 1880s, you could go around claiming that you had been cured by walking around wearing a vibrating belt or vibrating underpants, and nobody thought you were a weirdo because of it. I'll just move on a little bit from there. Over here is George Manier, a judge and abolitionist who died of typhoid fever. And there's a little unmarked plot to talk about right over here. Yeah, you know, there were people in 1918 saying we shouldn't be calling it the Spanish virus. Nobody really knew where it came from. But even going all the way back, we'll talk about this over the course. You know, there were arguments, so should we call it cholera or Asiatic cholera? Same sort of thing. I try to refer to it as the 1918 pandemic instead of Spanish influenza myself, but sometimes I slip up, as it's what they always called it at the time, when they weren't calling it the grip. Okay, so this unmarked space here is actually, by most metrics, the first burial here. It was Daniel Bryan, the son of Thomas Barber Bryan, whose burial is really why we have a cemetery here. He initially died in 1855 at the age of 5. I've never found a cause of death for him, but he was buried at the Old City Cemetery where Lincoln Park is now. And Thomas Bryan said that he found the place absolutely repulsive and thought, you know, we've got to get a proper cemetery around here. And just having a big one in Lincoln Park to begin with had been the city's attempt to be really progressive. So when the city first started growing in the 1840s, most people who died in large cities were still buried in churchyards that got really overcrowded really quickly. So the smell in those places got to be absolutely horrific. They were starting to figure out that these were, in fact, public health hazards, which they didn't really understand why, but they knew that having something that disgusting in your midst probably wasn't all that safe. So, in fact, if you really want to lose your lunch, you can look up a book called Gatherings from Graveyards, which was a London Sanitary Commission's report on churchyard conditions in the 1840s. Everywhere they went, there would be like open pits of gunk and effluvia. So this is an unmarked space now. Initially, Daniel Page Bryan was buried right over where the giant Eli Williams statue is now. For some reason, in 1890, he was moved over here into this unmarked space. And I don't really know why they never had it marked. I know there's a bit of a movement now to have a little monument to Thomas Bryan here. Bryan is actually buried in D.C., but there is some talk of having a cenotaph put up here for him. A cenotaph is what they call it when there's a monument to somebody who's not there. Vibrating Underpants, what a great band name. Okay, well, you called it. Move along up through here a little bit. Great many of these obelisks, I looked them up and it turns out he was a lumberyard owner who never did anything other than owning a lumberyard that anybody ever thought to write down. Happens quite a lot. Thank you for coming, Teresa. I'm going to move up over here to this obelisk coming up. So up over here, this is Dr. Daniel Brainerd. Brainerd was traveling west as a young man in the 1840s and stopped when he got to Chicago, mainly because he had run out of money to go any further. But he set up a practice as a surgeon, quickly really made a name for himself as a popular surgeon. He was doing complicated surgeries, complicated enough that they would make the news at the time. And shortly thereafter, he became one of the founders of Rush University. Now, one of the other founders is buried in an unmarked space not too far away, and the widow of that guy says that they named it Rush University after Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of our founding fathers, because they thought that maybe if they named it after him, his ancestors, his descendants, would send them some money. In fact, they just sent a nice thank you card. But Dr. Brainerd ended up being not only a pioneering surgeon, his students called him the Count, which I think has different connotations now. When we think of the word count, we immediately think of Dracula. I think in those days it just meant a regal bearing. So we've got his portrait is carved onto the stone here, and I think it's pretty clear it was probably based on this portrait of him right here. He spent a great deal of his time studying in France. He developed an iodine cure for snake bites. Now, also, but right after he got back, he was staying in the old Sherman Hotel when he became infected with cholera, which the newspapers called the Destroyer. This was 1866. Now, we had a number of cholera epidemics in Chicago over the years. 1866 was just about the last of them, really. We're going to cover several of them, but one thing about these tours is the geography and the chronology don't always go quite hand in hand. But I'll show you a little bit of the paperwork. This is October of 1866 when he died. Notice the causes of death here is cholera, 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 cholera. Cholera is a disease that you get initially from contaminated water. Now, at the time, they still hadn't figured out all of the details about what they could possibly do to treat it, what they could do to stop it from spreading. There were a couple of things that they were starting to do already. In 1866, they were just finishing digging out the lake tunnel. It was a mile-long tunnel underneath the lake so they could start getting drinking water from further out inside of the lake, where they figured the water was going to be clearer. And that actually did help quite a bit. I mean, it's not like bacteria can't swim for a mile, but it actually did help quite a bit. Now, it's kind of interesting reading the cures. There were a lot of doctors' reports covering what they tried to do to help the cholera patients. The number one thing was brandy. And if you couldn't get the brandy into their mouth, they had other ways of doing it, and I'll kind of leave it at that. But mostly it really just kind of made you feel better. It didn't actually help anything too much. There was also, at the time, I'll read just a little bit of an excerpt here from the paper right the same week that Dr. Brainerd died. The paper said, "There was, however, one kind of business in which a brisk trade was run during the week, the sale of quack medicines. It would be the work of some time to count up the number of applications we have received within a week past from parties interested in the sale of some nostrum which, if it did not cure cholera, would at least profit the seller. Ointments, oils, spirits, champagnes, opiates, nervines, cordials, tinctures, bitters, etc. ad infinitum have all been advocated." Now, how many of those actually worked? I'm going to go ahead and say probably none. But just think of this. This is 1866. Imagine how much of a quack you had to be labeled as a quack in 1866. This was 20 years before you could go around wearing the vibrating underpants and say that was curing you of the rheumatism. So this is Walter Newberry. Walter Newberry himself died at sea. There's a rumor going around that he was buried in a barrel of Medford rum. It's from my research, it turned out that it's partially true. He did make the rest of the journey to France in a barrel of Medford rum, but by the time he was shipped back, he was in a normal coffin. Now, two of his daughters are also buried here. One is his older daughter, Mary, died of tuberculosis in her late 20s. She was known for, after her father's death, she ruled the household with an iron fist. His daughter, Julia, said, "I'm always so much happier when Mary has something else to do than bother me." Another woman in the cemetery remembered Mary specifically as a veritable goody two-shoes. Now, his other daughter, Julia, wrote a diary that was published and kind of a bestseller in the 1930s. She remembered her father always telling her, "Be somebody, Julia, be somebody." But she herself always suffered from ill health. She ended up dying in her early 20s. She's actually buried in Rome, right near the poet Keats, whom she absolutely adored. But all through her diary, she talks about her ill health, mainly to do with sore throats. It's thought that the disease she had resembled diphtheria. which was a disease not as many people get anymore. The various inoculations cover it. Move on a bit more from here. So good to see everybody out there today. Uncle Dave, hi from side of sunny Georgia. Not too sunny out here. But, you know, as I was saying at the beginning, I feel like this is the best way for it to be. It's very photogenic when it's like this. We're just going to kind of veer around over to one of the most famous gravestones in the cemetery here. This is Mr. Dake, who was a baker, who has this really cool Gothic-looking one here. Then over below, we've got what the landmark paperwork calls polychromatic tumuli. Underground vaults, all in different colors. I love these. They're like little brothers of the townhouses over in the neighborhood. Includes Dr. Menkluski, Emil Gross, who by some metrics was the first batter at the first Phillies game. But we're going to veer around a little bit here to cover probably the most famous grave marker in the cemetery. Hey, Jeff in Milwaukee. And so far, the rain took a break. Now, I run rain or shine when I'm running tours. But it is nice that the rain took a break. We've got the umbrellas just in case. Aiden is holding on to the umbrellas. And now I'm going to pass it over to him. All right. What we have here is possibly the most famous gravestone in the cemetery. This is Inez Briggs, or Inez Clark as she is often known. It's a name she probably would have taken if she lived just a few weeks longer. Now, there's a lot of urban legends about Inez. The most popular is that she died after being locked outside during a thunderstorm, and that now when there's a thunderstorm, the statue disappears and her ghost runs around. We should really let her parents off the hook for that one. Now, about 10 years ago, you might remember there was a period where you couldn't turn on the television without seeing 8 or 9 different ghost hunting shows on. During that period, the cemetery started denying that Inez ever existed at all. And I don't blame them. People were like showing up with shovels and all kinds of gear wanting to do experiments over here. But in the cemetery records, it actually says that her name is Amos Briggs. Or that's the only person buried here. But it seems to be a typo. Her name was Inez Briggs. Clark was her mother's later married name. Inez grew up primarily with her grandmother, Jane, and her step-grandfather, David. I've been able to put a lot of stuff together about her, a lot of which hasn't been published yet. It's been kind of sitting on it, waiting for the Graceland book to come out. It'll probably be on the Petraean a little bit earlier. But what we do know is that she actually died at the age of 6 of diphtheria. That's a bacterial infection that comes in the throat. It causes your entire throat to swell up. It was very common at the time. You see it as a cause of death all the time. But what even more common is her brother right next to her. This is a little less widely known, is that next to Inez is her brother Dilbert. Dilbert died of cholera infantum, which was probably the #1 killer of urban children in the Victorian age, the Gilded Age, in Chicago terms. We don't really know what disease it was. It is now thought that it wasn't really a disease on its own. It was just misdiagnosed malaria. But it was caused by things like crowded conditions, poor sanitation, contaminated water. So he contracted that just at about the age of 6 months. He was initially buried in a section of single graves. When Inez died, there was the family bought a new plot over here. And part of why I think we can tell that Mary and John had just gotten married at the time is that there's a letter from Mary saying, I grant permission to move Dilbert. It's she calls herself I, Mrs. John Clark, but then she signs it Mary Briggs. Like she hadn't quite gotten used to her new name yet. About a year before Inez was born, at the age of 16, married a guy named Wilbur Briggs, who took off to spend more time drinking when Inez was about 1.5 years old. And we'll move on a bit more from here. Now, there'll definitely be a lot more about Inez coming up in the upcoming Graceland book that I'm doing for University of Illinois Press. Right, I'm sure you've witnessed a couple of my tours of the pouring rain. Definitely that one this year, yeah. So a little side note over here. We'll do a couple of things on the side. This is Tuthill King, this angel. It was the first white bronze monument in the cemetery. Usually white bronze has more of a bluish tint than this. It was a salesman's term for zinc. Tuthill King, when he was into his 80s, caused a bit of controversy because right before he died, he married a woman who was about 60 years younger than he was. So the rest of the children fought the will for a really long time. And he officially said, "Oh, it's only because I'm old and sick and she's a former nurse and knows how to take care of me. It's really just a business relationship." But they went on a honeymoon like any other couple. Hey, Dominic. Is there a children's section? Not a specific one. There are a lot of individual ones, though. Like there's an orphan asylum that had a section for itself. This is Daniel Thompson. A couple of early guidebooks say this was the first monument in the cemetery, though I don't think that's accurate. Because I don't think it was built till 5 or 6 years after the cemetery began. One of fairly few that has curbing around it. That was mostly removed back in the 1880s and up through the 1930s. We've got a bit of a stretch down here, so I'll go ahead and plug the, up above this, there should be a link to the Patreon, the Venmo, the PayPal. You know, I'm kind of reinventing my job from the ground up. I was supposed to be doing this as a regular tour today and then flying off to New York to work with school groups for a couple of weeks. Well, here we have one of the McCormick lots. There are several lots of the McCormick family. Cyrus McCormick famously invented the mechanical reaper, made an absolute fortune. This is his brothers Leander and William, who are not in his plot because they kind of hated his guts. William died in 1865. He suffered from nervous dyspepsia, which is a stomach condition that, again, it's one of those things people talked about a lot back then, but you never hear about nervous dyspepsia anymore and can't even really read anything about it written after about 1895. I don't know too much about nervous dyspepsia. But William McCormick was kind of a jerk. He quit going to church because there were too many abolitionist sermons. We'll get to the McCormicks again later. Making our way down over here. I'm glad to see everybody. What a crowd. There's more people than I expected. That's fantastic. Oh, now I mentioned that they turned him down for the Shiloh burials. There is a guy over in this space over here. There's a bit of an unmarked space for a guy named Daniel Fardham who was killed at the Battle of Shiloh. He was shot through the heart. And at one time there was a monument. The newspapers talk about him having a very large marble slab erected by his friends at the Literary Society. It had a very long epitaph on it. It must have been it must have fallen apart at some point. It's certainly not there now. Now, the newspapers also say that his white marble column once casted shadow over the remains of Senator Stephen Douglas, but then they didn't elaborate on what they meant by that, which is utterly bizarre to me. One other thing to point out in here, I noticed this, just trying to find things to fill over here, is there is somebody in this section whose date of death was October of 1918. I couldn't figure out for sure whether it was a victim of whether it was a victim of the 1918 pandemic, but in there someplace. But if it was October 1918, there's a pretty good chance it was the 1918 influenza. That was the week it got especially bad. We'll cover it again with several others. Now here's one I've been working on just lately. Is little May Nyman here has a marker from the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, her father, John, was in the Grand Army of the Republic. May herself died during the Civil War at the age of 7. I'm not really sure why they've got the marker there. There were not a lot of 7-year-olds in the Grand Army of the Republic. And to keep things on a slightly lighter note over here, as I said, this is actually more morbid than most of my tours end up being. But over here, I'll just point out one of them that I always loved. Is, I don't know how well you can read this, but Scott Bram, 1955 to 2005, couldn't wait for the Cubs to win it. He was a lonely South Side Cubs fan. Unfortunately, the Cubs did not make it to the World Series within his lifetime. And he died 11 years before their eventual victory. There's actually a few different Cubs-themed gravestones around here. And I personally love that one. There's like a pop culture reference on a gravestone. I found one with a Smashing Pumpkins lyric right towards the end of working on the book. It's like, well, I'm not going to leave that out. We've kind of walked around in a circle here, as you can see. Silas Cobb was a notable businessman in his day. But, you know, I got a million of those. So I'd love to find more interesting stuff about him. We'll be passing Mary Wilmarth right here. Mary Wilmarth was one of the wealthy society women who also became a really radical activist. Was associated with just about every progressive cause in the city from about the time of the Great Chicago Fire up until her death, right before women finally got the right to vote. But here we're going to be moving back a little further into the past. So I'm going to turn this over to Aiden. So in the early 1830s, young Philo Carpenter was told by a friend that this new muddy town called Chicago might be a pretty good place to make a name for yourself. So he showed up here in time for, showed up here in 1832 to work as a pharmacist. He was a trained apothecary. He was really our first pharmacist. But he showed up right at the same time that General Winfield Scott showed up. We can zoom in on him. This is General Winfield Scott. I don't think I've ever seen a picture where it didn't look like he was pooping. He showed up with some soldiers from the Black Hawk War at the old Fort Dearborn, and they brought cholera with them, or as they called it at the time, Asiatic cholera. Most of the citizens who lived in the area fled for a while. He later said that he had never had any enemy that he fought that scared him as much as the cholera did. Because with cholera, you couldn't fortify your works against it. You couldn't offer terms of surrender. There was really nothing you could do about it. And dozens of his soldiers died shortly after they showed up. Now, Philo Carpenter himself had some medical training, so he tried to do what work he could in trying to help. Here's a portrait of Mr. Carpenter. But mostly he was pressed into service helping to bury the bodies. There was a massive grave for cholera victims dug right about where Lake and Wabash is now. And for years, people would reminisce about it and say, you know, I don't think they ever moved those guys. It's been re-landscaped many times now, so it would be way, way below the surface of Wabash Street, but they're presumably still there. And one of the more amusing anecdotes is, while they were working on burying the bodies, while Philo was working, one of the people he was about to bury sat back up and started talking. History does not record whether he said, "I'm not dead yet, I feel happy," but I really, really hope that he did. And this was something that happened. Even in 1866, there was an anecdote published in the paper saying that one guy had been pronounced dead. His family had just had the coffin arrive, when it turned out they had just put too much brandy into it. As I mentioned, that was the main way that they were fighting cholera in 1866, was pump as much brandy into a person as they possibly could. So he fell asleep. And having fallen asleep, they thought he was dead. Turned out he wasn't. Move over just a little bit further back here. Now, Philo was also really active in the Underground Railroad. He was one of the founding members of Chicago's Anti-Slavery Society, bought a whole farm up in the what would now be the north suburbs, just as a place to hide refugee slaves until they could get them on a boat to Canada. I just about tripped and fell there, but that's all right. I fall down on this job way more than I should probably admit. So, I mentioned earlier on that Daniel Page Bryan, who died in 1855 and was moved here in 1860, was the first official burial here. But within the grounds, there was already actually a grave at the time. It just wasn't a part that had been incorporated into the cemetery yet. The northwest section on the opposite side was the land of Conrad Sulzer, namesake of the Sulzer Library. And on his property, in his garden, was the grave of his son who had died back in the 1840s. So this was moved before they had bought everything. It was one of the first removals over here. But this is technically the first grave that was in the cemetery, from a certain point of view.
From a certain point of view?
Yes, Aiden, you'll find that a great deal of many of the truths that we cling to depend upon a certain point of view. And we'll move on from here. And we're coming up on one that I absolutely can't leave off a tour. And by that, of course, I mean the Sherman family, with their giant obelisk here. No, the Sherman family, Mayor Sherman was mayor a couple of times in the 1840s and again in the 1860s, built the Sherman Hotel, which is where Dr. Brainerd died. But really what I'm talking about is right in front of us here, probably the most famous monument in the cemetery, Eternal Silence, built by Laredo Taft. Now, I wondered for a minute how I was going to connect it, because I can't really do a tour of Graceland Cemetery and not include Eternal Silence. One thing I realized, though, is the sculptor Laredo Taft also did a bust of Philo Carpenter. So this is about the best picture I could find of Laredo Taft's bust of Philo Carpenter. But same sculptor did this one. This was built by a guy named Henry Graves. He and his father Dexter came to Chicago in the 1830s when you still had to travel here by schooner. But Henry later remembered that his father got fed up with the schooner. In Detroit, they went and got themselves some horses and ended up beating the schooner there. So this was built after Henry's death in 1907. By then, his father Dexter had been dead for more than 50 years. Yes, Fountain of Time as well. Now, he put aside, his will is a pretty good ride. He put aside $250,000 in 1907 money to build this thing. Now, I've looked at other statues that were built at the time. Going rate would have been $15,000 to $25,000 for something like this. So, really, it's hard to imagine what else happened to the money. But he also had put aside $30,000 for a statue of his favorite racehorse. That never got built, but it was supposed to go right where Laredo Taft's, one of his other Chicago statues, the Fountain of Time, is built, down in Washington Park. Now, of course, there are a lot of urban legends about this one. I'd be very disappointed in Chicagoans if we had a statue like this and there weren't a lot of urban legends about it. One of them holds that if you look into its eyes, you will see your own death. I've looked many times, didn't see a thing, so I figure I'm good to live forever. That's my idea anyway. We'll keep moving on from here. Great to see so many people here. Laredo Taft also built the statue of Chaim Solomon with George Washington that's on Wacker Drive. Down here is Mausoleum Row. There's lots of gorgeous mausoleums, not a lot of interesting people there. It's all like guys who own factories, vice presidents of chewing gum companies. Sorry about the cough, it's just my usual chronic sinus infection. I'm sure all of us are coughing and wondering, oh my God, a lot these days. By no means excluding myself. Never would have thought phlegm would taste so good. Sorry, I'm being disgusting here. Here's Daniel Elston, namesake of Elston Avenue, another typhoid fever victim. Now, I mentioned before there aren't a lot of graves with the curbing around here. Something you hear quite a bit is that went out of fashion in the 1870s because the 100th anniversary of America rolled around and people started saying that things like that, these curbs around graves, walls around graves, were undemocratic. And I always thought, yeah, right, this is just because lawnmowers had been invented or something. But there were actually several articles in the 1870s praising Graceland for taking out the curbing in the walls because it was undemocratic. It's very unusual for people to actually comment on symbolism like that. Like, off among these things, you can see things like draped urns. Like, you often see that if you look up draped urns as a symbol online, it'll say that it represents the veil between life and death. And that may be, but I don't really think anybody ever actually walked into the monument company and said, hey, I want to symbolize the veil between life and death. What do you got for that? Nor does anybody actually look at a draped urn and think, makes me think of the veil between life and death. But things symbolize whatever we want them to symbolize, and very rarely do they actually write it down. Now, one thing I should say is I don't have a way to monitor my battery usage on this. So, as far as I know, I'm doing okay. I had it all well charged before the tour. We're going to move up over here to one of my favorite guys to research. This guy just fascinates me. He's one of those guys that, if you've been following the videos I've been doing daily, he's come up quite a bit. He's one of these guys that I really think should be a part of Chicago history, but somehow fell through the cracks. Turn the camera back to Aiden. So this is the grave of a guy named James H. Collins. He came to Chicago to work as a lawyer back in the 1830s. At the time, he lived in a very small apartment, so small they had to cook outside, where cows would regularly steal his vegetables. I hate it when that happens. But he was best known as a lawyer for his work in the abolition movement. He was a really hardcore extremist abolitionist. He even said that if you saw a police officer attempting to arrest a possible runaway slave, it was your moral and legal right to attack that police officer using force if necessary, because they had no right to arrest a possible fugitive slave in Chicago. What they were doing was no different than if they were kidnapping anybody else on the street. So he was widely known as a really irascible guy. I think he actually liked to make people mad. He was also known for buying real estate that people thought rightly belonged to other people. But in 1854, he fell victim to one of Chicago's periodic cholera infestations. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times we had a lot of cholera waves over the years. In fact, 1849 to 1854, basically every summer there was a cholera infestation, though 49 and 54 themselves were probably the worst of it. In the case of 1854, he was actually contracted it in Chicago, but it didn't manifest until a couple of days later. He had gone off to Ottawa, Illinois to argue a case. During the day, he argued the case just fine. That night, he started feeling bad. By morning, he was dead. Cholera killed people very, very quickly. And in fact, that year, it killed about 1,400 people, which in 1854 was pretty close to a full percentage of the city's population at the time. But it was very unfortunate. He died just as his fellow abolitionists were started to get a little more noted. Now, overall, there's one guy I know of here who died in the 1849 cholera epidemic. He's a little bit off the geography to get to from here today. But after 1849, Levy Boone, who was one of the city's chief physicians at the time, tried to improvise a hospital. Because we were 8 years away from having a proper city hospital in Chicago. But he ran into a lot of red tape and a lot of people objecting to using city resources like this. He said, "This is not even the first time I have tried to make a hospital and inhuman people have tried to stop me." But I don't want to talk about Levy Boone as though he was a hero or anything, because after the 1854 cholera epidemic, Levy Boone became a mayor of Chicago as a member of the Know Nothing Party and blamed the 1854 cholera epidemic on immigrants. He really did not like immigrants. Levy Boone is actually buried at Rose Hill. We'll move on a bit more from here. I'll go ahead and take the camera. It is a very photogenic day here today. Over on the side, once I get around the bushes, you'll be able to see the chapel designed by Holabird and Roche, currently closed to the public, of course. Now, we might even get lucky and see some coyotes today. Usually I would see them earlier in the morning than this. But if you're on the Patreon, the coyote pictures I was posting over the winter got so popular I had to take them down. It was kind of more publicity than the coyotes probably wanted. But they're on the Patreon. They'll do a couple a week. It's one that I wanted to point out right here. Captain Lucius Larrabee. After he needed a finger amputated after the Battle of Bull Run, they carted out the ether and he said, "No, I don't need anesthesia. Just cut it off." So they amputated his finger and he stood there and watched. Afterwards, he stood there for a second and said, "Next time I will get the ether." Captain Lucius Larrabee ended up fighting in a number of different engagements, Bull Run, Yorktown, but of course he ended up being killed at Gettysburg. He was killed on Little Round Top. This is actually a Gettysburg tree here. It was grown from a sapling from a tree in Gettysburg. Gettysburg sycamore, according to the sign. That's a Pickett's Charge black walnut behind him. We'll move on a bit more. Some of these on a regular tour. We passed a lot of them today that I would talk about on regular tours, or talk about in more detail or in different detail. Really, I can walk the same thing and do different tours every time. It's been really fascinating doing the research for the book. Hear the L train going by over there. No, he is actually not the namesake of Larrabee Street, I don't think. But it's difficult to tell. A lot of times I find that the actual namesakes of streets are not really that well recorded. Over here we have John Jones, who owned a tailor shop. He was the first black man to get rich in Chicago. He and Frederick Douglass went to the White House to lobby President Andrew Johnson to give black people voting rights. President Johnson made a complete fool of himself. Kept calling himself, "I am the black man's Moses," while denying voting rights. Asked Frederick Douglass if he had ever been on a plantation, which I would say was a major party foul. Is the cemetery also an arboretum? Yes, it is. We'll pause just for a second here at Pinkerton. In fact, I'll hand the camera over to Aiden for a second. Now, Alan Pinkerton has one of my favorite epitaphs in the cemetery: a friend to honesty and a foe to crime. Alan Pinkerton came to Chicago initially to help on the Underground Railroad. According to his friends, it was in his work on that field that he developed all the skills he needed to start Pinkerton's National Detective Agency. He had figured out that in Chicago, we had a new mayor every year at the time, and every time the new mayor would shake up the police force. So the police force was very much a political body, so he started his own. Now, the earliest adventures I can really find of the Pinkertons is in 1856. They helped capture people from Dr. Brainerd's Rush University who were stealing bodies from the Old City Cemetery in Lincoln Park. Now, at the time, medical schools needed all of the cadavers they could get. By 1856, Rush University was a pretty high and mighty institution. They got to be really fierce rivals with the Chicago Medical School. But in this metaphor, the Chicago Medical School was the scrappy band of misfits. Rush University was the rich kids' camp across the lake. They always seemed to have all of the cadavers that they needed. Dr. Brainerd was never personally implicated in helping to dig up the bodies, but it's impossible not to imagine that he must have known what was going on. I mean, every medical school had figured out by then that you cannot train a new doctor without giving them dead bodies to practice on, but nobody donated their body to science. Pinkerton and his men found that they were bribing the city sexton, the cemetery manager, for helping pointing out where the bodies were that were fresh, which ones didn't have smallpox, helping guarding from the cops. He was even helping with the digging at the time. This led to a really interesting back and forth. For a couple of weeks, the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Times went back and forth arguing about whether the city sexton was a Republican or a Democrat. Now, newspapers wore their party affiliation on their sleeve at the time. Off of the side, you can see this ridge that I call Pride Rock. The coyotes like that. Robin asks, can you talk about the L station that served Graceland back in the day? Do I know when that went away? No, I don't know a ton about the train stuff. I know there used to be an entrance right over here at at Buena Avenue. I don't know when exactly it went away. It's sort of like train stuff and bridge stuff. There are certain people who are just so knowledgeable about trains and bridges that I get kind of intimidated trying to know more than just the very basics myself. So great to see so many of you out here today. So good just to be working again. Oh, the one thing I will mention is in 1918, there was a plan during the pandemic to shut down public institutions, banning gatherings, basically shelter-in-place orders. However, let's see. We can see that parties at the casino club continued despite influenza ravages. And this actually talks about naming names of people who were still hosting parties during the flu gathering ban, one of whom was Mrs. William Chalmers, whose father was Alan Pinkerton. So let's all just kind of sneer at the colonnaded monument over there for Superintendent and Mrs. Chalmers, who kept on having parties despite shelter-in-place orders. Monument designed by the architectural firm Graham Anderson Probst and White, who also did things like the Merchandise Mart and the Wrigley Building. How many people are usually on the tour? I usually cap it at about 30 people. That's about as many as I can take before I feel like the quality starts to dip. And sometimes only a few people sign up, other times it's full. This year I was planning on just being able to do a few of them in the spring. Mostly I was going to be traveling with school groups. I love it when somebody gets my Chalmers references. I did find out the William Chalmers was the superintendent of something. It was like a factory. And he was on the school board. So here we have Governor Frank Loudon. This was the guy who was the governor at the time of the 1918 pandemic. And it was really on his word whether we were going to shut down things like the schools and the parades. And at the time, they weren't really sure what exactly was causing all of this stuff. There was a thing saying we should probably ban movie houses. Movie house owners said, no, you can put us on the front lines. Before every feature, we'll educate the public. We'll put up slideshows saying things you can do to help keep you from getting the influenza. They technically didn't really realize that slide one should have been stay out of the movie houses. But when asked, Loudon said he was leaving it entirely up to the city health inspectors and the state health inspectors. He would follow whatever they said to do. They said to close the schools. They said to close down sporting events, large gatherings, parades. And as a result, we did a lot better with Chicago ended up doing better. We didn't have nearly as many people dying in that pandemic as places like Philadelphia that kept having all of their parades. Move just a little bit over here. Am I going to do a video like this for the H.H. Holmes tour? Probably so. And also, those of you who asked how to contribute, up at the top link of this, there's a link to my Patreon, my Venmo, and my PayPal. So right next to it, this is Loudon's father-in-law, George Pullman. George Pullman's daughter was married to Governor Loudon. Now, I mentioned earlier the thing about medical students always needed cadavers, so grave robbing was a real problem. By the time that George Pullman died in 1896, that was kind of over. Most of the medical schools were getting all of the bodies that they needed. However, there had been a thing where a few months earlier, or a few years earlier, a guy had been stolen out of his crypt in New York, a prominent merchant named A.T. Stewart. Around the same time, there had been a story going around that somebody had tried to steal the body of Abraham Lincoln. And these cases were not for cadavers. They were to hold the body for ransom. So there was kind of a concern that people like Pullman, who was head of the Pullman Palace Car Company, and whose employees had just had a massive strike 2 years before his death after he required them to rent their apartments from him. He cut their pay but didn't lower their rent. This led to some massive strikes. So after he died, it was reported that he was buried, similar to H.H. Holmes, in fact, in a 20 or 30-foot grave that was full of cement, steel, and railroad ties. The Chicago Daily News even talked about like grubby men emerging from the bushes with shovels and rakes and implements of destruction to start digging the grave. Nobody's entirely sure now whether it's even true, but certainly he's got his one of his daughters and his wife are buried right next to him. If the story was as true as the newspapers made it out to be, there wouldn't have been anywhere near enough room for these two. Now, I will definitely keep you guys posted on when I do an H.H. Holmes tour like this. I think I've got enough footage that I can at least put a video together. And there will be stuff on the Patreon as well. If you're on level 2 of the Patreon, will have videos, longer videos every couple of weeks. Moving along over here. First of all, we've got Mr. Insel. Well, not Mr. Insel. Mr. Insel lost all his money and died in Europe. Mrs. Insel is here. Mr. Insel built the Civic Opera House. He was a utilities kingpin. But I just showed the newspaper article about the Casino Club continuing to host parties. One member of the Casino Club is over across the lake here. You can see this tomb that goes right up onto the water. This is Kenneth Sawyer Goodman. Now, Kenneth Sawyer Goodman was the son of a lumber family, but on the side he worked as a playwright. He was actually a very well-regarded playwright at the time. Wrote a number of things that occasionally are even still produced. He was also a big member of the Casino Club. His diary talks, it's mostly high society stuff, but there is one health scare in it. He suffered from headaches a lot, and I did find one mention in his diary saying, "My headache was terrible after the cocaine wore off." His diary is still on file at the Newberry Library. If you go there during regular times, you can actually read it in his own handwriting. He also enlisted the whole Casino Club to make what may have been Chicago's first independent film, which was called Cousin Jim and the Lost Fraternity Pin. He wrote the script for it. Now, eventually, he wouldn't have been at the parties in 1918 at the Casino Club because he was off with the Army at the time. And about a month after that party, he himself died of the 1918 flu pandemic. And he's not the only one around here who did either. We're going to walk over to another victim of that. Any Revolutionary War of 1812 veterans buried here? There are 2 War of 1812 veterans that I know of. Chicago does not officially have any confirmed Revolutionary War veterans. There are a couple in the suburbs. There's one supposed one in Lincoln Park and one supposed one in Rose Hill, but I don't think either of them can really be verified. I don't think they really were. But watch this space. I'm going to have some news about that fairly soon. Can't walk by here without seeing Ernie Banks, Mr. Cub. And beside him, Ruth Page. I love that gravestone. You can tell she was a dancer just by the simple drawing on there. In fact, Ruth Page was having things like lesbian characters in the 1950s, trying to plan all nude ballets in the 1970s. She later said that, if you just did what everybody thought you should do, you'd be awfully limited. But yeah, here is Ernie Banks, the first black Cubs ball player. He was supposed to be the second. They had hired somebody else, but then realized, well, we can't just have one. We have to have somebody be his roommate. And the other guy pulled a hamstring. And across the pond, you can see Potter and Bertha Palmer. And what looks like the Parthenon up there. We'll cross over here a little bit. Now, this entire section is known as the McCormick Wilderness. Now, going all the green space you can see here and really all the way back to the next road, this is the family of Cyrus McCormick, the Reaper King, who used his father's design to invent the mechanical reaper with help from his slave, Joe Anderson. But eventually moved to Chicago, became absolutely rich, one of the biggest real estate holders in the city. Left the country during the Civil War because he thought we were going to be plunged into an abolitionist nightmare. More than once, I've seen coyotes pooping on Cyrus McCormick, and as you can probably guess, I'm fine with that. But it's always interesting to see the shifting political loyalties. His daughter, Anita McCormick Blaine, was a really radical, they would have called her socialist and anarchist and everything else at the time. She ended up marrying Emmons Blaine, who was the son of a presidential candidate, James Blaine, who Cyrus McCormick really would have disliked. And beside him is their son, Emmons Blaine Jr., who was also off in the Army in 1918 and died in the 1918 pandemic. Now, one thing you'll notice, the pattern with a lot of these is it's young people who died in the 1918 pandemic. That's something we've never really explained to this day, is that particular influenza hit younger people an awful lot harder. There's some theories going around like maybe it was something like there had been a previous lighter strain that went around a few decades before that gave older people some kind of immunity, but nobody really knows for sure. It's one of those things we'll never quite figure out. Also, I think it just spread a lot more in army camps. Army camps were not really known for their sanitation. We've also, just to make it a little bit sadder, his wife was already pregnant. About a month after his death, the baby died as well. I usually kind of leave those things off of the tours. I don't like these to be depressing. We'll move on a little bit more. So there is one a little bit more lighthearted, not too far from here. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, this weird thing about the coyotes here is they tend to pick really good targets to poop on. Just yesterday I saw that they had hit Marshall Field. I'm fine with that. Or recently they hit a guy named William Clark, who was not a bad guy as far as I know, but he was really into sewers. One time he got to meet Henry David Thoreau and spent the entire time talking about sewers. It'd be awesome if you did a virtual tour of Rose Hill Cemetery. I think I can arrange that. In fact, I'm quite sure I can arrange that. Now, I don't have as much about Rose Hill because I haven't worked on their new Who's Who book or anything. But I do have a very good tour at Rose Hill Cemetery that I run several times a year. Now, it's interesting, I never see coyotes at Rose Hill. I see deer at Rose Hill. I just saw a deer. I just got a great picture of one outside of the tomb of Bobby Franks, who was famously murdered by Leopold and Loeb. But as I mentioned earlier, World War I largely ended because of the Spanish influenza. You can see any number of papers out there saying that was really what pushed the powers that be to end the war. Now up here we're in the grave of Mr. Armour. Feel free to start singing the Armour hot dog song. This was Armour the meat packer. But he had a grandson named Lester Armour. And just to tie into World War I, Lester was married to Alexandra Armour, whose proper name was Princess Alexandra Galzatine of Russia. Now, during the days before the Russian Revolution, before World War I, she was actually a princess in the Russian court. She said later she remembered very well the day the soldiers knocked on the door and said that they had to leave. She ended up fleeing to the United States in the 1930s, and for a while she just worked at Marshall Fields for a while. But shortly thereafter, she married another exiled Russian prince. The marriage didn't last. She ended up marrying Lester Armour. And you can see she lived to be over 100 years old. Eventually, she had her own boutique here in Chicago. When asked about her father, she would just say, "Oh, he worked for the government." Nothing about how she herself had been a princess. One of her daughters said in her obituary, all that she wanted out of life was a hardback book and a glass of orange juice, and she had both of those every day up until the day she died. We're going to be heading over the bridge in a minute here. We walk along, there's a couple of other interesting things to point out. Joseph Medill over in the corner, who was the editor of the Chicago Tribune. His granddaughter, Sissy Patterson, who was the editor of the Washington, I think, Herald Examiner. Total tabloid. She's another one that I have to tell most of the stories about her. You must be 18 or older. Now here is one that I just covered on my podcast, Cemetery Mixtape. Now, this is the tomb of the Getty family, designed by Louis Sullivan, one of our greatest architects. And really, I think this is the perfect example of Louis Sullivan's architectural style. But we can get so caught up in this, caught up in the architecture of it, that we kind of lose the fact that there are actually some really interesting people in there. So I'll cover this just briefly today. Henry Getty was a partner in Martin Ryerson's lumber firm. Now, Martin Ryerson also has a Louis Sullivan designed tomb over on the other side of the pond. This one I think is actually a lot better. But in it with him is his wife, Carrie, who died right around the time it was built, and their daughter, Alice. Now, Alice is one that I will talk about at great length. She was a composer for a while, then she became an expert on Buddhist art, lived in a monastery in Japan, wrote a manuscript about it, but that manuscript was destroyed by the Nazis. After World War I, she ended up in New York, never married, but lived with a woman who was her study partner. In the 21st century, that leads us to certain conclusions. But just to tie it in with World War I, you would kind of think that a woman who lived in a Buddhist monastery would have been in favor of the pacifist movement, but we've got a couple of letters on file from her writing back to friends in Chicago saying this Jane Addams person who's saying stop the war has got to be stopped. It's crushing morale over here in Europe. She actually thought that the pacifist movement was only prolonging the war. But she's a fascinating person. If you go on the Cemetery Mixtape podcast, which is on Spotify and all of those places, she was the subject of the last episode. I'll take the camera back. Just a few more things to cover here today. Hey, Aunt Sue. Were there no major cemeteries on the south side for all the people like Armour or those from Prairie Avenue? Most of the Prairie Avenue people ended up here. There were cemeteries down on the south side as well, Oak Woods being the biggest. But this was kind of the place to go. Over the bridge here is the great burial place of Daniel Burnham, the great architect. He's kind of my claim to fame lately. While I was doing research for the book, he's got his famous quote that we paint on the walls all over Chicago: make no little plans, they have no magic in them to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans, aim high, and hope it in work. It's been quoted about once a month in the Chicago Tribune for the last 60 or 70 years. However, there's always been an asterisk behind it. Nobody was really sure if he actually said that or it was just something somebody made up years later. While I was researching the Graceland book, I found the original source of the quote. It turns out he really did say it. Got my name in the paper for that one. I always love it when I actually get to solve a mystery. One I'd like to solve is what happened to Princess Clara de Chimay. This is the monument to the Lyon and Gary family. Thomas Lyon was the legal guardian of a woman named Clara, who married the Prince of Chimay and then kept the gossip columnist busy for years. She ended up spending most of the money, left the prince for an itinerant violinist, and her own burial place is not known. She died in Europe. That's about all that we know. We'll stop over here just a bit. Edith Rockefeller McCormick was once known as the richest woman in the world. She was a member of the Rockefeller family, that's money. She married Harold Fowler McCormick, a son of Cyrus, who eventually left her for an opera singer of questionable talents and helped inspire Citizen Kane, though he didn't go so far as to actually build her an opera house. But Edith, for all of her money, spent a lot of it keeping psychics and astrologers off the streets and out of trouble. She firmly believed and told everybody she met that she was the reincarnation of King Tut's first wife. The other society people just had to kind of smile and nod through this. But buried with her are Editha and John, her children, both of whom died of scarlet fever. Now, cholera infantum is generally listed as the biggest killer of children in urban areas at the time. Scarlet fever's gotta be a close second. You look through the internment book, scarlet fever comes up a lot. If you look at the mortality list that they would publish in the papers every couple of months, scarlet fever seems to have been the biggest thing. That was a bacterial infection that often developed out of strep throat. And it can still come up today. It's still highly contagious, but it's a lot more treatable now thanks to antibiotics. Just a couple more to cover today. This is an interesting twist for me. Usually I have to plan the route so we end up back at the gates. Today I can do things a little bit differently. There's one I've always wanted to feature on the tour. Coming up over here, it's currently an unmarked grave. But up among the single grave section here is an unmarked space, currently unmarked. I think the process is underway to have it marked, for a guy named Dr. David Lee Hull. Now, he was a professor of the philosophy of biology at Northwestern. Now, philosophy of biology is a field that he basically invented. Some of his papers and books on the subject are still extant and still relevant today, which is rare in academia. But towards the end of his life, when people asked him about that, he would just say, boring, and talk about what he was really interested in was reminiscences of what it was like to be a gay man in Chicago in the 1950s. And he always said in the 1950s, there were exactly two clubs and the two bars that he knew of, one called Volleyballs and one called the Scarlet Ribbon. One was lesbian, one was gay. They were right about where the St. Valentine's Day Massacre is. If you were ever on my old ghost tours where we stopped in the Clark Bar, I think it might have been about the same physical space where the Clark Bar was. The way he described it, it was the men's side would be men dancing their heads off, the women's side would be 6 women getting in a fight. He ended up losing his partner. His partner was one of the first AIDS deaths, and he was just absolutely shocked how badly he was treated. He wasn't even told that he had AIDS until he said, I seem to be dying. Should I make arrangements to donate my body to science? And they just casually said, oh, they don't take AIDS patients. So after that, he opened up his own home. His own home became kind of a hospice space for AIDS patients. At any time, there would be as many as like a dozen people living in the place. And he never quite recovered his own stamina after that, after his recovery. He never contracted the disease himself. But he died just a few years ago. His space is in the process of being marked here. One guy described him as 5'2" and the biggest man I ever met. Yeah, it is a perfect day for a cemetery tour. Yeah, the philosophy of biology, I've looked it up. I've looked up his books. It's all way over my head. It's about all I can say. The slab here is Harlow Higginbotham, who ran the credit department at Marshall Field Store. Also hosted a lecture by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in his home one time. And we'll move on a little bit beyond this. See the L train going by over there? Now and then I see coyotes in this section. This isn't one of their major haunts. The altar coming up behind the bush here is Mr. Charles Wacker, namesake of Wacker Drive. Now, in 1918, during the 1918 pandemic, I think one of the reasons it was the ban on public gatherings was lifted as early as it was. It only lasted a couple of weeks. But Governor Loudon was really pushing for the Good Roads Rally. They were going to have a big parade to celebrate good roads in Illinois, which Wacker had pointed out didn't really exist. There were 96,000 miles of roads in Illinois. Only about 800 of them were considered good roads, like less than 1%. But at the time, there was an election coming up, and there was a good roads amendment on the ballot that the governor was really pushing with help from Mr. Wacker. I'm going to close off with one more, so I'm going to turn this over to Aiden again. Again, Aiden is my stepson / cameraman. We don't have to be too socially distant because he lives in my apartment. But right back behind me is Henry S. Everhart. And this one isn't necessarily public health, but after the Great Chicago Fire, the whole city was wiped out in 1871. The bell from the courthouse fell down, was still in pretty good shape. You couldn't ring it like a bell anymore, but a lot of people wanted a bit for a souvenir. Thomas Barber Bryan, the founder of Graceland Cemetery, originally bought it. He was a collector. He bought things like the handwritten draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, and I think really running a cemetery, you're kind of collecting people. It kind of fit his personality. But he didn't have anything to do with the bell, so he sold it to Henry S. Everhart. Henry S. Everhart was only about 20 years old at the time, but he immediately started a business where he melted down portions of the bell and used it to make what was called charm bells, little miniature bells that were souvenirs of the Great Chicago Fire. I just want to point it out because that's the spirit of Chicago. We go through tough times, we get creative, Chicago rises again. So thank you for joining me today, everybody. I am Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. At the top of this post, there's links to my Patreon, links to my Venmo, links to my PayPal. Thanks so much for those of you who have already contributed as I work here to try to get my job reinvented from the ground up. If you go to the Mysterious Chicago Facebook page, I've been broadcasting a little miniature video or so just about every day. So everybody, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago. Stay safe out there.
Well, all right, everybody. There you have it. That was the virtual tour that started it all. The very first real Mysterious Chicago tour. We've done a couple of morning mini tours before that, but that was the first one. Wow. That was pretty good. I don't look back and think, oh man, that's really cringe or anything. I definitely think it improved when I figured out that I could just narrate live the whole time and be able to put up the pictures and everything. That's a cool way to do it too. But I couldn't have that little bug at the bottom saying where the donations were, so I found that when I did try to do it like that, I made way less. So let's put some Benny on. Thanks for all the anniversary wishes, and to those of you who donated tonight.
And they all loved it. They all loved those fastens when they played by Benny Goodman. And now another one just in the same vein, Rosetta.
That was a little bit longer than we normally go. Quite a bit, really. I usually go for about 40 minutes on a virtual tour. Yeah, Stay Spooky came along later. Oh, I'm tired out, too. Only 20,000 steps today. It was an easy one. That's a good point. This is about to be a video. I was thinking about it. Loading kind of gradually, but it's getting there. This is Miles freaking out about, as he tends to do, about shadows.
Music by Benny Goodman is being presented from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. And now Benny Goodman's arrangement of the Bugle Call Rag.
I'm trying to get this one to load too. There's a great video of Charlotte watching TV Cats in our very crowded old apartment. Let me just show that a little. Remember little Charlotte? Miles and Charlotte in the cat stand. Videos are a little slow to load. There's Charlotte with Crookers, her old roommate. And we had two tabbies. Crookers passed away about a year before all of these started. He was old. He was an old man. Charlotte would just watch and watch cat videos. One time she tried to jump into the screen to get them. And she would just sit and listen while I told her about Star Wars for the longest time. And when she was little, she loved to play with money.
And that would put rhythm in the feet of a
And
wooden
she and
Indian.
Miles together.
That was the bugle call rag, Benny Goodman's own arrangement. Now, the popular tune, Thanks a Million.
And here's Charlotte with Hipster Bert. Oh, and of course, let's see, we got this. There's this for one thing. She loved to box with Mirror Cat. But the real classic is Charlotte and the Liquor Cabinet. We all wanted a drink at the time, didn't we?
Down Harlem Way, they're all trucking. And here's Helen Ward to tell you all about it. Trucking.
I gotta find some, I have to download some older ones, I think, to get Miles' airplane rides. It wasn't that long before he was too big for that and couldn't do it anymore. Thanks for all the donations tonight, everybody. That's very kind of you. I'm off to Memphis tomorrow. All over town. Yeah, poor one for Charlotte. She was trying so hard to get into there. Pat. Fulton. What else? Tomorrow the mini tour will probably be late. I think I'll still be in the air when it starts. But then again yeah, I gotta figure out what time zone Tennessee is even on. Jordan, I've been to the other Graceland. My favorite part wasn't really Graceland itself, it was the really tacky Days Inn from down the road, which was blasting Elvis and Full House in the lobby while old ladies wearing entirely too much makeup and poodle skirts that they were probably too young for when they were actually popular, just staring daggers at me for some reason. Awesome. Just what you hope for when you travel. You meet lots of interesting people outside of Graceland, I can tell you that. Yeah, it is going to be about bedtime for me. Yeah, I remember when I was at Elvis's Graceland, I got some shots thinking I could use it on Cemetery Mixtape or something.
Benny Goodman presents On the Alamo.
If you saw the ghost of Elvis on Union Avenue, you'd be walking a long way to follow him up to the gates of Graceland. Let me tell you, folks. (1857) in Tennessee. That's true. I think there's a cemetery downtown or something. Laura, I've taken school groups to both of those. Last school group I took there was kids from Ohio. The kids were great. The parents were very annoyed that the Civil Rights Museum had a Black Lives Matter exhibit. They thought it should have stopped in about 1968. That is such a Martin line right there, the Mile Die Club. Ooh, the Hotel of Rain. I'm too tired to remember more details tonight. I am working tomorrow. At least I'm not on anybody's clock. Well, no, they thought that civil rights was over now, that I had to explain. Their town, I looked up their town, it was 99.3% white. And, you know, again, me preaching on these tours is not really going to change anything. It's not really going to help, but most I can really do is crack the door open. But I was able to talk to the parents about that kind of thing and why they were upset about it and how living in a town that is 99.3% white might color their understanding of the situation. Same way I could talk about like The Outsiders musical a little bit with the group, which it's great that they have such diverse casting, but if we're this is a class war in Tulsa in 1967, and nobody mentions race. Are we letting Tulsa off way too easily here? It's its own kind of whitewashing in a way. I don't want to bug me too much, though. It's a great show. My thing is just kind of crack the window open, get the people out of their bubble on these tours. Just show them that cities aren't terrifying. And very often I see, queer kids from small towns, how they react when they see a church with a rainbow flag. And that's always kind of moving to see, really. Find a grave from 30,000 feet. Yep, he's right down there someplace. Let it fly away. It's interesting that I'm getting different numbers. The Facebook thing says I got 74 watching, whereas Restream says 150. But I don't think I have as many people on all the other platforms as I do on Facebook. How do they react? Yeah, the queer kids definitely know what a rainbow flag means. They live in a small town, not under a rock. They've just never seen that at a church before. No, seeing a church that wouldn't throw them right out and talk about how they were going to hell is it's pretty overwhelming to some of them. Yeah, it was higher before. It always goes down at this point.
And we'll let the title speak for itself. Benny Goodman presenting Madhouse.
Good night, Pamela. I gotta be packing too. I'm about done. Yeah, I'm about done. It's all good. Good night, Carol. Yeah, I kind of need to be sleeping. What grave are you guys talking about? What can you see here? I'm not broadcasting a grave at the moment. All right. Well, good night, everybody. Thank you for joining me for this anniversary tour. Thank you for joining me all of these last 4 years. Thank you all for the last 4 years for giving me something to do during those times when I had nothing to do. I'm glad that I was able to provide information and entertainment and community for all of you as well. So because I didn't know how to say it last time, I'll say it now. Stay spooky, everybody. I'll see you a little bit late tomorrow. I'll try to keep you posted. Have a good day.